Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of DefDave's 1984. I'm your host, DefDave, and on this show, we are taking a comprehensive chronological journey through what I consider to be the best year ever. We are at the end of a fantastic run of episodes with a bunch of stuff happening all at once. You have to go back when we talked about Ridley Scott directing the 1984 titled commercial that aired during the Super Bowl for the Macintosh, and today we are going to be talking about the debut of that product. It would hit market just 2 days later. I am not the guy to talk about this. I barely know what I'm talking about. I have with me the only expert I could possibly want. I am thrilled to bring in Kate Fox, the Macintosh Librarian. Kate, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. No, I'm honored to be here.
Took me a little slow with the buttons there, but welcome to 1984. Before we get started, why don't you tell me how you got here? I'm assuming that you weren't around for 1984 the first time, but I'm glad you're able to join me today. What time travel device did you use to come find me here?
The DeLorean, definitely the DeLorean. Good. It's stainless steel. It's perfect. I've always wanted to go in a DeLorean, so I had the chance to go back in time to 1984 and visit you. So
excellent. Very good. Yeah. So we are here now on January 24th. On January 22nd, Super Bowl Sunday, we had Ridley Scott's commercial come on to advertise the Macintosh, and it would hit the markets today. And so what I want to do, we're covering all aspects of the year. What we so not just pop culture, but also news headlines, and in this case, consumer products, emerging technology, and this seems like a fairly significant event in the evolution of personal computing. So thank you for being here with me. We will definitely plug your channel at the end of this episode because I want people to know all about it. But first, before we go too far in talking about this product, why don't you tell me a little bit about, I know that you weren't around for 1984, but do you have any favorites from that year? Any pop culture events or items or things from 84 that you're excited about?
Yeah. So when I think of 1984, I definitely think of all the movies that I watched when I was a kid, all the VHS tapes that I would go rent from Blockbuster. Terminator, the original one, definitely. I saw Terminator 2, and then I was like, well, what was the original like? And so Terminator is definitely up there as far as big impactful movies for me. Awesome. Especially how it deals with kind of computers and AI and robotics and everything. And there's always a time travel aspect to it as well. So I think that's really amazing.
Very good. Any music from the year that jumps out to you? Anything in particular?
I don't.
It's okay. It's before you.
I definitely love 80s music, but I don't know if I can pin down 1984 was this.
All right. Well,
I definitely Depeche Mode. I think that's 84 time, maybe a little after.
It's all around there.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what. Keep watching this show, and you'll learn all about the music from 1984 because over the course of these 4 seasons that I have planned, we will cover every major album, every significant artist, rock, rap, pop, R&B. It's all going to be right here. But let's go ahead and dig into this. You have the Macintosh Librarian YouTube channel. It's huge. You've got over 25,000 subscribers. Anybody who likes Macs, and I guess likes the history of Apple, should already be signed up for your channel. Just for the context of framing this conversation we're going to have tonight, tell us what is your channel about?
Yeah, so my channel focuses on the human aspect of early computing. And specifically, I'm trying to cover not just Macintoshes, but there's a big emphasis on the Macintosh because that was a pivotal computer for my upbringing. They were in schools, they played a big part of my getting to know how to program computers and getting interested in the world of just technology and engineering. My channel is Macintosh Librarian, and I talk about the history of different software, different hardware, Apple related, definitely, but also other hardware too. I'm working on a video about the Commodore 64 as well. So it's not just Apple. So I do try to branch out, but I do have a puppet sidekick named Mackie, who you might be able to see in the background, kind of blurry.
Nice.
I definitely was inspired by a lot of like Jim Henson and like Pee-wee's Playhouse, that kind of vibe of like not just sitting down and talking about, the computer or the software, but also having a little bit of fun with it with puppets and having like a inquisitive character that always wants to know, how things work. And so it definitely makes it a lot of fun. I hear a lot of parents like to watch it with their kids, but it's definitely not for kids. So it might look like a kids show, but it's not like it's racy or anything. It's just, we talk about computers and software. So it's great for the family.
That's all right. Any Jim Henson influence I am going to approve of. So that's fantastic. Is there anything in particular about Apple's history or the history of the Macintosh product that you particularly find fascinating or interesting?
So the Macintosh came out in a very kind of pivotal time of computing. And I think really the story of the Macintosh is like the story of people, both the consumer and the people that made it. It's kind of one of the first computers that was like geared toward being a friendly computer, being made that doesn't scare people away. You have a mouse, you have a pretty interface, it welcomes you with hello, like you have on the screen. And it looks simple, right? It's a simple interface. And there's a lot of folks that were, they poured their blood, sweat, and tears into making this machine happen. And I think by the fact that we're still talking about it now, I think that blood, sweat, and tears was, put to a good product that kind of stood the test of time. And now we still use our iPhones and Macs today. So,
Yeah, I did not have a Macintosh computer myself or in our household. I was 13 in 1984. I remember this coming out. Looking at this product, it's very familiar with to me. Takes me way back. I do know that by 87 or 88, we had an Apple IIe, and
nice.
that was our first personal computer that we had. I was still in high school, and I remember having the 2E. It was a monochromatic display screen. It was green. We had a dot matrix printer, and I did a few book reports on it and things like that. I think I had print shop on it, but the Macintosh is not one I had, but I do remember friends of mine having it. So when I think Apple, I think Steve Jobs.
Right.
He was, you know, Jobs was on this product launch, right? Why don't we just do this? Give us the origin story of this product, like of the product development, like how did it come about, and like who came up with the idea and stuff. Just give us the origin
Yeah.
story there.
So everyone knows Steve Jobs and, he was the CEO of Apple very famously. So that's a picture of him back in the 70s. So kind of the history of Apple in general kind of goes back to the early 70s when Steve Jobs and his friend Steve Wozniak, in they kind of met because they had friends in common. They were both nerds in the not Silicon Valley, but in the Palo Alto region at the time. And they kind of got into the whole phone hacking scene at the time. And so there was this little box that there was plans floating around, like ham radio magazines and build it yourself kind of technical magazines where you could build something called a blue box. And that essentially simulated the dial tones that you could put up to a phone, and it would trick the operator machinery on the other end into thinking that you were actually putting coins in, and then you can make a free long distance phone call. So essentially, Apple was kind of started with money that was funded by kind of piracy. So there's always this
Okay.
kind of like pirate ethos behind it.
Yeah,
And
I'm interested in that. in that early hacking history where hacking computers and hacking phones were very much intertwined from the very beginning. It seems like.
Yes, they definitely were. I think, phones kind of interconnected America, and there was always people were always curious about how does it work and how can I break it? How can I if I can figure out how it works, maybe I can supersede its kind of limitations that are there.
Well,
So,
I'm gonna just off the rails here for a second. I believe, according to my research, before 1984 is over, I think it comes late in the year. We actually get the first hackers convention, and that's something I want to dig into. Maybe we'll do an episode on that if that sounds good to you. Maybe
that sounds
that
awesome.
if I remember correctly, it's late in the year, so we're several years away from getting to that. But I'm fascinated by that
Yeah.
early hacker scene. I think so. So kind of describe again, like take us along the trail here of how
Yeah.
we arrived at the Macintosh. What came
Yeah.
in?
So, Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak meet. You probably heard of the Apple II, is the one that you had growing up, and this little green guy behind me is an Apple II. Um, Eventually, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak started making the Apple II is kind of like the uh, a cheap, I believe it was under $1,000 machine that was kind of flying off the shelves. That's kind of what put Apple on the map. So in the 70s, it was all, Apple Commodore with their pets and TRS, the Tandy Radio Shack. They had their computer as well. So those are like the big three. And they were chugging along for a while. That the Apple II was still on the market for a while, and it was still selling. It was iterating, of course. They had the 2E and stuff, but it was all incremental iterations. So they were trying to figure out what the next thing was going to be, right? Like, is it going to be something that is more geared towards these home users? Or was it something more geared towards businesses? Because businesses were also starting to get more computers. Um, they were starting to get like IBM PCs and things like that. So, what Apple was looking for was kind of what the next thing would be. And they kind of had different paths that they could have gone on. There was the Lisa project, which started in the early 80s. And that the Lisa is kind of like the predecessor to the Macintosh. So the Lisa was aiming to be like a business oriented machine that you could type your Word documents, you could do your spreadsheets on, and you put in the big 5.25 inch floppy disks
Right.
and had a black and white screen similar to the Macintosh. But again, this came out a year prior, and it was also $10,000 in 1982. So that was a that was a pricey machine, and it kind of sank like a lead brick a little bit on the market because business folks were like, "Well, I have this IBM, it's cheaper. I don't need to learn this new stuff. There's not enough software for the Lisa." And on like the home user side, they're not going to be able to afford something that costs $10,000 unless you're a rich, um, CEO of a company or something like that. So it didn't go well. And Steve Jobs, actually, the board of Apple pushed him out of the Lisa project. And so Steve Jobs was looking to kind of, he's a hacker. He's kind of he likes to stir the pot. And so he was looking for his next project. And there was a gentleman by the name of Jeff Raskin who had he was starting he had a lot of great ideas, and he wanted to create. He was an Apple employee, and in the early 70s, he wanted to, or sorry, late 70s, 79, he wanted to explore the concept of like a computer that could cost maybe less than $500. And so he was kind of aiming for a text-based machine that you can operate with a joystick. And um, the GUI concept was kind of there, but it was more like he wanted to make a friendly machine that was cheap, low cost, and kind of a all-in-one device. And
So there was some form of a graphic user's interface at this point.
in the 70s, not yet,
Okay,
but getting into the early 80s, there was just not by Apple.
gotcha.
There was a lot of research done at Xerox, the copier company, the company that everyone knows for just making copy machines. But they were doing a lot of research at their Palo Alto Research Center for Park, and they had developed these machines that they're essentially machines that had a user interface. The computers were about as big as a filing cabinet with a monitor on top. Uh, they were essentially used for typing documents, doing kind of your making layouts on pages because the screen was actually vertical to look like a page, and it had a white screen with black text on it, very similar to the Macintosh. And um, in the history of things, there's a tale that Steve Jobs got a got wind of this Xerox UI, this user interface concept. And so Steve Jobs ended up cutting a deal with Xerox in about 81, I believe. And that's when, no, sorry, 79. Just taking my dates here. But in 79, Steve Jobs and a couple people from the Lisa team went over to this Xerox Palo Alto research facility, and they got to see it, but they couldn't actually touch it. They couldn't use it. They couldn't look at like the code or anything, but they got to see this user interface. And what they saw definitely impressed them. And it definitely kind of set Steve's mind to focus on this user interface concept. And I think that's what people most remember about the first Macintosh is the graphical user interface. The black is gone are the days of just having a text cursor and you can type commands on the screen where you have to like memorize different commands. Now you had a mouse, you have little icons on your desktop.
So
Um, yeah.
84 with the rollout of this product, that's where the general public starts to learn about a mouse, right? And
Yes.
clicking on windows and dragging things around
Right.
because
The mouse was a very new concept at the time, which is something we take for granted now, but yes, so the Macintosh back in 84 introduced the mouse, and that
well,
was a magical device.
well, tell me how we get from Raskin to Jobs because they weren't on the project at the same time, were they?
Um, they were initially.
Okay,
So whenever going back to I mentioned how Steve Jobs was on the Lisa team
right.
and they kind of pushed him off because it was a lead brick, it was too expensive. Um, Eventually, Steve Jobs kind of commandeers the Macintosh team, and the Macintosh team at the time was Raskin and a couple other folks. So, the concept of like this low cost appliance that Jeff Raskin kind of cooked up, uh, Steve Jobs kind of took it over and started to make demands, so to speak. He started to demand perfection in a way. Like, I want this to be such and such price. I want this to be, have a graphical user interface just like Xerox. I need it to have multitasking. I need it to have smooth animation. I need it to boot up fast. So eventually, Steve Jobs became so demanding that Jeff Raskin in 82 ended up just leaving Apple altogether because Steve was kind of kind of pushing him a little too hard, I think. And
I gotcha.
yeah,
I
just
gotcha.
taking the Macintosh into an area that Jeff originally, he wanted something cheap. He wanted something that was kind of an extension of the Apple II that people already knew. And now it
Okay.
was turning into something else.
All right. So let me tell you my impression of things, and you can correct me here. So
Mhm.
it feels like I mean, at this point, IBM's dominating. I think you already said that.
Right.
And that, tell me if I'm right, but I feel like my impression is that they were catering to businesses and corporations, and there was an idea here at Apple to market to consumers. Like the idea of having a computer in your home were these the revolutionaries with that idea, or was that something that was that all there was already somebody in that space and Apple was looking to I guess increase their share in that, or was this like Apple's domain was personal computing at home?
There were three or two other competitors with personal computing at home. That would be Commodore. At the
Okay.
time, the in '84, you also had that came out in '82, but the Commodore 64 was
Okay.
out, and it was really cheap. It was like 500 and $600 about there.
Yeah. And you hooked it up to your
So
TV, and your TV was your
yes,
monitor, right? Yes. I
right,
remember
right, right.
playing on those. I played on those when they were cutting edge. Yeah.
So those were cheap enough, and those kind of were satisfying a lot of home users, right? You had a lot of games for it, you had a lot of software, you had basic, um, and then you had the Radio Shack,
The TRS. Yeah.
TRS-80, those
Okay.
line of machines as well. So they had competition at home. And in the business side of things, yes, they were definitely dominated. Business world was dominated by the IBM PC because IBM had established their foothold, while Apple and Tandy and Commodore were fighting for the home market, IBM was establishing itself as the business machine,
Okay.
right?
Eh, well, if you got anything more on like the market conditions of this moment in time where they're rolling out the product, share that with us. But also, include in that like the marketing plan. Obviously, the Super Bowl commercial was a big gamble, and I wonder like what was the buy-in at the executive level? Was everybody on board with this? Was this an internal fight? Who was fighting for it? If that was the case, like and then just kind of do you know the story just around these few days here in 84 between the commercial actually getting done and on the air and then the product hitting the market and what that initial response was like?
Yeah. So when the commercial came out at the Super Bowl, the Apple team was still working really hard on the demo for the Macintosh.
Okay.
Um, and they were still, so I guess the marketing aim for the Macintosh was to get the Macintosh to the people that were afraid of computers, the people that, you know, the artists, the thinkers, the writers, the people that Steve Jobs and people at Apple believed that if they had a computer, they could improve their lives tremendously. Make things simple. They could write on a computer rather than on a typewriter. They can organize their lives. Um, but they saw that the command line interface of a lot of these older computers was kind of limiting them to using it, right? You had to memorize these commands to use an older computer. So the Macintosh was definitely geared towards the artist and the kind of the free thinkers of the time, the others, or the people that wanted to see themselves as others, at least, right? Just like the Super Bowl commercial where you had the woman
Exactly. I was
throwing the hammer at the screen. You're fighting against the man, fighting against IBM, and essentially you're trying to find, they're appealing to the audience that wants to use the computer more for the artistic side of things. And I think that Apple was definitely successful at filling that niche.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I mean, I've known at least for the last like 20 or 30 years that was kind of the space that Apple cut out for themselves was like we are geared toward the creative, toward the artist, toward the graphic designer, or the musician, or something along those lines. And you take it back to 84, and it's interesting for me to see that that was kind of the mindset from the very beginning. And you mentioned that commercial. I talked about this in the Ridley Scott episode that we did a few weeks ago, that the color palette for that commercial is very bleak, very shades of gray, almost a black and white
Right.
approach to it. But then the girl with the hammer comes running in, and she's in bright colors, or she's
Right.
brightly lit, bright colors, and she's bringing that energy, and she's grabbing your attention. I think the color and the lighting play a big part in separating her from the rest of her world that's in that commercial. And I think that that is symbolic of what you're talking about right here. So IBM, you're thinking very cold, business-like
Right.
approach. This is all just like command prompts and running code at your corporation. And then here comes somebody who just wants to create and doesn't want to have to learn code and can do something fun with it. So
Right.
that is, it's interesting to me to see that that was kind of the space they were trying to carve out for themselves
Yeah.
from the very beginning. So
Right.
awesome. Okay. So how did it go? First of all, yeah, tell me how did it go? What was the response like? Was this a success like immediately? Did the commercial work for them, or was this a slow burn for them? I'm assuming it was a successful product. Like I'm throwing a bunch of questions at you at once. You just kind of give it all to me, but in that, I wonder, like, how long before like the next gen product came out? How long did this
Right.
one? So
So
tell me the story.
yeah, so after the Super Bowl commercial, there was another famous presentation that Steve Jobs put on in California at the Apple shareholder event. This is like a couple days after the um, uh, Super Bowl commercial, and he pulled the Macintosh out of a blue bag, plugged it in, turned it on, and this was the first time the world got to see the Macintosh, right? In the Super Bowl commercial, they didn't show the Macintosh.
That's right.
So this was the world's first look at the Macintosh. And Steve Jobs said he would like to let the Macintosh speak for itself. And he turned it on and it said, "Hello, I'm Macintosh. It's great to be out of that bag."
Oh, that's funny.
And so the crowd went wild. Everyone was clapping, taking pictures. And I think Steve Jobs actually like was shedding tears because, the having the Mac talk was something that like Andy Hertz, like the programmers and the folks that were kind of doing all the work to make the Macintosh happen, they were spending nights staying up 48 hours, 72 hours just trying to get this demo to work. It's a graphical demo similar to that hello that you have on there where it would write out hello and it would show the words as it talked, which was a pretty amazing demo. Like you haven't seen a computer do that
Well,
and speak.
was this a case of they weren't entirely confident it was actually going to work, and
They
and
were
it did?
I think there was an issue where like it didn't work sometimes and they got it to work like right at the last minute. And like you couldn't press any keys or move the mouse at all on on the machine. So
Nobody touch it.
yeah.
Yeah, I imagine that made quite an impression. So
Yeah.
that's
It
pretty
was
awesome.
a big impression, yes. But yeah, you mentioned the initial sales and like how, was it successful? And um the the original Macintosh, definitely the first people that bought it were kind of, I believe it in one of the books that I read recently, by Andy Hertzfeld, who's one of the programmers on the Macintosh. He said that people were kind of seduced into buying the original Mac. Um, it was a little limited, so now our computers have gigabytes of RAM or memory, right? You can
I did want to ask you the specs of this first machine, so I'm interested
Yeah,
to hear what you're
so
going to say.
it only had 128 kilobytes of RAM,
Oh,
which, that's like what? That's like 3 seconds of like a song that you're going to listen to now on like an MP3 or whatever. So
Hmm.
it was definitely limited. And even at the time, it was a little limited, especially for the graphical user interface and the floppy disk that it had. So initially, it sold about 70,000 units or so, like in the first few months when it was on the market. But um, the sales started dropping off. The people that were really into computers and the people that wanted to do real work, having multitasking, having larger documents on their machine, were running into memory limitations. And so people started asking for, you know, we want a Mac that had more memory, uh, a fat Mac, as some people called it.
So I imagine the GUI was a big hit. I imagine the emphasis on graphics was a big hit. I'm guessing this was attracting creatives, and clearly you're going to run into a memory issue fairly quickly. So
Right.
so did that give this original Macintosh a short shelf life in the market? Like when did that next follow up product come out?
So actually in September of 1984, the um, the Macintosh 512K came out, which essentially quadrupled the RAM or the memory that it had on board and gave you the ability to um, have better desktop publishing and have bigger documents. You're able to copy floppy disks easier because back then a floppy disk actually took more memory than the computer had. So, so to copy a floppy disk, you had to take the disk out, put in the new one, put the other disk
Oh
in.
yeah,
You had to
I
do a
remember that.
like a
I
dance of
I think I did that
changing
with
the
the
disk.
2E a few times. Yeah.
Yes, yes. You had to kinda do a disc jockey thing where you're swapping the discs out. But yes, so eventually a newer Mac did come out, the 512K. But there were some folks that tried to make upgrades at the time for their older Macs. But the original one was definitely, in my opinion, kind of like a beta, right? Like it's the people that want to live on the bleeding edge, that want that graphical user interface and that want that mouse. They were the ones that bought it.
And I think probably I'm guessing, you just tell me if I'm on the right track here, that maybe the biggest accomplishment of this product was just getting that Apple name in people's heads and increasing awareness of the company and their product line in general, I would guess.
Yeah, definitely. It made Apple an innovator, right? Not just yes, they were already an innovator with their Apple II, but they were already, they were kind of in the soup of other companies at the time. And
Okay.
this put Apple in the you like Macs because you're an artist, you're a free thinker, you think different, right? And it definitely put them on the map as kind of like the innovative computing company.
So how would you describe the cultural impact of this first product, and did is it enough to say that this revolutionized personal computing, or is it just the beginning of what Apple would do during the '80s, that kinda bigger picture changed things around? Like, what do you see big picture in terms of impact on the culture coming out of
Right.
this product rollout?
Yeah, I think this product, the original Macintosh, definitely broke the glass on like having the biggest impact. And yes, there were other computers that came out later that definitely were, you know, rode, you know, the original Macintosh laid the foundation for these other Macs that came down the road, but this cemented, Apple's name as being like an innovative machine, being a computer for artists. The original Macintosh definitely kind of made people realize that computing could be for everyone, not just for the nerds or the people that had, you know, a PhD and a minor in math, right? You didn't have to be a kid programming the Commodore 64 at home. you could easily, with a mouse and a keyboard and the user interface, use a computer. And I think that's kind of the big cultural impact that the Macintosh had was it broke that barrier for usability, and it allowed people to see the computer as something that's friendly and something that anyone could use.
Okay. Now, so what I've learned in this conversation is the Apple II came out first, but
Yes.
would you say that this original Mac was a bigger hit in the consumer market? Or was this their first big hit, or did it eclipse the Apple II, or did they just realize, all right, this is definitely the direction we need to go in, but we got more work to do?
Right. The Apple II line of machines kind of served a different niche, I think, than the Macintosh. There were definitely so the Apple II didn't stop when the Macintosh came out. The Apple II line of machines kept iterating up until and even was being sold up until like 94, 95, I believe. So you had, and especially in the education market, the Apple II software was just the library of software was just so vast. You had all those Oregon Trail and number munchers and games like that. Like those, the Apple II fan base and the user base was just so vast that Apple kept them on even as the Macintosh grew and became, multiple times more powerful than the Apple II.
Okay.
Yeah. So the Macintosh um, was kind of like an alternative line. I think the way I think of it in my head is like the Apple II is a great machine if you're like if you're a kid, like from kindergarten to maybe like maybe middle school or high school, but then when you go to college, you graduate to the Macintosh where you can start programming in C, you can use the interface, you start dealing more with graphics and design. So that's how I kind of feel like it. Like it's an iteration.
I got you. I got you. Well, I am fascinated. I'm glad to shine a light on this from 1984. I mean, obviously, the Apple would continue to go in the direction of serving the creative community, serving artists and serving designers. And I feel like we see that start right here in 1984. Thank you so much for coming on this show and talking about all this with us and sharing your expertise with us. Do you have any trivia, any fun facts or personal anecdotes when it comes to these early years of that? I know you weren't around in 84, but I can already tell just from your channel and from your background there that you kind of collect these old machines, and I'm imagining you're pretty familiar with them. Do you have any fun facts or insight for us?
Yeah, so the original Macintosh, the 1984 one, on the inside of the case are the signatures of all the 40 folks that were on the Macintosh team.
Oh, wow,
So
cool.
actually, this Mac back here, well, I can't open it, but if you were to open it on the inside, embossed in the plastic, has everyone's signature
Oh, sweet.
because they were like rock stars, and Steve Jobs says you had to sign it
Yeah,
because it's a revolutionary device. So
yeah. Hey, and
that's a cool little Easter egg.
that is pretty awesome. And the whole story, of working in their garage and coming up with and just inventing computing like that is
Right.
that's a whole another episode. But I imagine that's probably stuff that you've covered on your channel. I'd recommend people to just check out everything you got over there. I did. I was in attendance for a corporate like business seminar, and Steve Wozniak was one of the lecturers.
Oh,
And
that's amazing.
so I got to
I'm
hear his
jealous.
presentation, and I heard him give his version of the history of how it all got started there in
That's
California in the garage
amazing.
and stuff. So that was pretty cool, I have to say.
That's
Uh,
pretty awesome.
yeah, it's
Give me his
fantastic.
number.
I wish I could. I wish I could. All right. So before I get you out of here, before you get back in that DeLorean, and I mean, I don't know. I don't know if you really want to go back to 2026 or not. I mean, you're welcome to stay here in 84
85,
with
84 is looking pretty nice.
okay. Tell folks about your channel and what it's all about one more time.
Yeah, so I am Kate Fox. My channel is the Macintosh Librarian. You can find me on YouTube. Just search Macintosh Librarian. my channel is all about the history of Apple, history of software, history of early computing, with an emphasis on how it impacted people and, computers and early education. And because that's really where I got the start in caring about computers.
That is awesome. Yeah, everybody check that out. Macintosh Librarian, huge YouTube channel, and it's kind of retro, right? It's kind of focused on the
Yes,
past,
definitely.
like
When I say
old
yes,
tech.
oh, yes. So we're talking about Apple computers from the 90s and back,
There
typically.
you go. All right. That sounds very good. All right, I'm going to get you out of here. You don't have to go back to 2026 if you don't want to. You're welcome to stay here in 84 all you want, but it's time for me to get out of here. So, Kate, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right. Talk to you later. All right, folks, that's going to do it for this episode of DefDave's 1984. I want to thank Kate for coming on the show and talking to us. It was fantastic. We are going to, next week, we are going to turn our attention to January 27th. We're going to go ahead 3 days, and we're going to talk about the new album from a legendary rock star that perhaps not a lot of people were expecting to get an album from, because he had actually been dead for over 3 years. I'm not going to tell you who it is, but he's someone who left an eternal influence on music. I'll just say that I am not the Walrus. I am DefDave. So let's come together next week on DefDave's 1984.